Hello, everyone. I'm Massi Masture, who kept sending you emails, reminding you of things. I just finished my PhD 3 weeks ago, and I've been Nira as a student since 2005. What I want to say today is really to say a big thank you, and just to recount one of the most vivid memories and how I started learning in a different way. It goes back to 2005, and it was the time Ahmadinejad announced that Israel should be wiped out of the map. And going back to Nira's class the day after, which was all over the news, I was feeling that I'm obliged to apologize to Nira about this. So I went to her after the class, and I said, as an Iranian student, I said, Nira, I wanted to say something. And she said, what? I said, I'm really sorry about what Ahmadinejad said yesterday. And she was looking at me, and she said, Massi, we are not representing anyone. And I said, yes, but I'm Iranian. So what? She said. Ahmadinejad is saying whatever he feels like to say. So it kind of this memory. Maybe I just want to tell you that how much I've moved on from such a positioning from 2005 to 2011, and I really owe it to Nira, who hasn't been just a teacher. She has taught me a lot in my life. How to deal with problems, how to not to give up, how to be confident about my work. And another thing, actually, which struck me, a few months ago, 2 months ago, Nira's son contacted me to help him about some characters in his book. And when we met, he said to me that you're a colleague of Nira. I said, no, I'm a student of Nira. And this is just her way of referring to her students as colleagues. So this what Marcel said about egalitarian relationships. She's trying to look for ideas and not just looking at them as students, but as colleagues and scholars, young scholars. And this is really, really appreciated. And really, thank you, Nira, for whatever you've done for all of us. Thanks a lot.
Are there any other comments that anybody would like to say? What a beautiful, I have to say, yeah, it's literally a days-old PhD, sort of still wet. And we do owe so much of today's organization, really, to Massi. So, so all that needs to be said now to really lower the tone is that we'll have lunch. And for those of you who didn't have your cash for lunch, if you could actually go and
I mean, the work that I'm doing now is I'm working with groups of Iraqi academics and human rights activists who are interested in introducing women in gender studies at university, but also in terms of increasing research capacity for evidence-based research for Iraqi women's rights activists. Organizing meetings with regional academic activists who already have much better, much more experience in these issues. It's not training.
Is this with the government?
No.
Because the government is like hiring so many people.
No, I wouldn't have that. No, it's not exactly that. No, they wouldn't be doing that. No, certainly not. And you know the new Minister of Women's Affairs in Iraq?
No, but you talked about it just now, and that was horrific.
No, I mean, they're actually never.
Is she from Dawa? I mean, what is she?
Yes,
Which part of just lost my nose. No. A little. I think she kind of laid the groundwork. I don't. Yes, you.
Yeah, of course. Just make sure to speak in the microphone. We would like to start in a minute, so if you could go back to your seat, please. I don't know if there are people still outside. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice lunch. We've already started touching on some of the themes in the previous sessions, but now we'll focus specifically on the question of women and fundamentalisms, and who better speakers could we get than Pragna Patel and Gita Sahgal. I'm really very happy to be chairing this session. Both of them are, of course, founding members of WAF, Women Against Fundamentalism, and have been working with Nira for many, many years on these issues. Both of them will be speaking for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open this up for discussion. In your printed bios, you find more information about both of them. I'm not going to speak, because once I would start, it would take me for a long time. Take me a long time. Okay, Pragna, would you like to start?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm absolutely honored to be here today, Nira. And just to show how much you mean to me, I had to wrench myself away this morning from a cricket match. It was the final day of West Indies versus India. And when I left, the match was balanced on a knife edge. So if anyone knows the results, please tell me afterwards. It is an absolute honor to be here, to be able to speak in this celebratory event for my friend and colleague, Nira. I've known Nira as a friend and comrade since the late 80s, I think, and really have come to admire the pioneering work that she and Floya have contributed to our understanding of race, class, gender, nation, state. And I think I need to say this publicly. They were theorizing intersectionality before it became fashionable, as demonstrated, I think, by their book, Racialized Boundaries, amongst many others. We at Southall Black Sisters are very quick to draw on their work, particularly in relation to our work on violence against women in Black and minority communities, and their contribution to the work of SBS, which tries to operate within a feminist, anti-racist, socialist, progressive, secular framework, has been immense. It is also fair to say that we were doing intersectionality before it became fashionable. But it was a theoretical framework provided by Nira, Floya, and others like Afdar that helped us to articulate the complex connections between race, nationality, class, gender, in ways that did not lapse into dangerous forms of identity politics. Instead, their analysis helped us to develop a simultaneous anti-racist and anti-sexist gaze at all forms of social relations that reproduce power and powerlessness. And above all, they helped us to develop a politics of solidarity across feminist and anti-racist struggles, perhaps exemplified best by the establishment and work of Women Against Fundamentalism, of which Nira, along with SBS and others, women from many different ethnic and religious backgrounds, have been founding members. So WAF was first established in 1989 in the aftermath of the Rushdie affair to challenge the rise of religious fundamentalism in all religions and its impact on the reproduction of patriarchal norms of the family and control of women's minds and their bodies, which are seen as signifiers of the collectivity. And although we were women from disparate anti-racist and feminist traditions, we came together on the basis of our commonalities and needs and not identity. And that is something that I think Nira in particular has reinforced in her work. In the British context, our resistance to religious fundamentalism involved a focus on the racist nature of the state, as well as a dominant but dodgy model of multiculturalism. In terms of relations between state and minorities. And by analysing our different locations as women, within majority and minority communities, were able to thrash out, with some urgency, I would say, a common agenda for resistance. And one of the first reflections of the thinking and activism of the WAF collective was the book Refusing Holy Orders. Like Racialized Boundaries, this book has become something of a touchstone, particularly in the work of Southall Black Sisters around religious fundamentalism. And some 22 years later, I think it was that long ago, I still find myself dipping into and rereading sections of it. And I'm always struck by its complete accessibility. My God, academia can be so, so kind of obstructive in many ways, but this book is so completely accessible and relevant today. In fact, more so now than ever, I think. From the useful working definition of religious fundamentalism as the political use of religion to gain power over resources and constituencies, through to clarifications on how and why secular public spaces are important, the book has been instrumental in making sense of the rise of religious fundamentalism and the religious right in all communities, a development that has since accelerated greatly under New Labour's cohesion and integration agenda and the Tories' big society and localism agenda. So above all, Refusing Holy Orders has given SBS the space to connect the politics and practice of multiculturalism to our work on violence against women in BME communities, since the history of both are inextricably linked together. And Nira, along with Gita, Sahgal, has been key in helping us to shape our critique of the politics of multiculturalism, which has created a conducive context for the rise of religious fundamentalism and, more recently, multi-faithism. Assumptions about homogeneity of communities and cultures, about claims of authenticity, are some of the themes that run through the book, which have also been central to Southall Black Sisters' work on religious fundamentalism. And one of the very first cases that SBS undertook, which allowed us to challenge both racism and religious fundamentalism, was that of Rabia Janjua in 1990. And she came to SBS's attention following her detention by the immigration authorities, who were seeking to remove her and her 2 young children to Pakistan, where she faced charges under the then Zina ordinance for unlawful sex outside marriage. And the Zina ordinance were part of a raft of legal measures that had been introduced by General Zia ul-Haq to aid the Islamicization process in Pakistan. And the campaign that we waged on her behalf and supported by WAF challenged both the impact of religious fundamentalism and the racist framework of the immigration and asylum laws. We were calling for the recognition of gender-based persecution in asylum law, and thereby interrogating asylum laws for not only for their racist effects, but also from the point of view of the human rights of women in their battle against religious fundamentalism. And this has been an important dimension in the fight for accountability from public institutions in respect of women's human rights. And of course, Nira, we've had many debates about the relevance and the true understanding of international human rights frameworks and the rule of law, for that matter. And Nira has rightly pointed out that the human rights framework is itself not neutral, and that it often masquerades as a universal framework when it is in fact used to shore up majoritarian or imperialist or capitalist forces and interests. And while this is the case, in the absence of any other mechanisms of accountability at local, national, and international level, I think it still remains the only tool we have to challenge the undemocratic, racist, patriarchal abuses of power, both in the family, community, and the state. And much of the work of SBS is geared towards making the human rights framework meaningful for the women that we see and for other powerless subgroups. What we can't afford to do is to vacate the legal and political human rights arena or abandon the principle of the universality of human rights, precisely because fundamentalists and the religious right are also using the language of human rights to great effect to actually subvert it. Paradoxically, they deny the use of it They deny the use of what they see as secular or Western human rights framework to women and other vulnerable minorities, but at the same time, they conveniently use the same secular framework to expose state-sanctioned torture and illegal detention. So of course it means that it's doubly important for all of us, including the human rights movement, to ask some hard questions about alliances that are formed in the struggle for human rights. And there is much to be done to safeguard the view that human rights are non-negotiable and indivisible. It's in this context that I think it's also important to remember how much the analysis of the impact of religious fundamentalism on women and girls, as set out in Refusing Holy Orders, has contributed to the development of human rights case law in the protection of women. One really important illustration of this was the outcome of the Shabina Begum case, in which the highest court in the land gave a decision that was influenced by refusing holy orders. People will remember that this 2002 case concerned a 14-year-old Muslim girl who wanted to wear the jilbab rather than a salwar kameez. And the salwar kameez was actually something that conformed to the school's uniform policy. And in 2006, a House of Lords, now known as the Supreme Court, delivered a judgment stating that her right to manifest religion or belief and her right not to be denied an education had not been violated, and that any infringement was necessary and proportionate for the protection and well-being of the wider community. However, in the course of the judgment, the courts also alluded to the fact that her challenge had been motivated by those who sought to impose a political religious identity on women and girls. Specific mention was made of the fact that in all her dealings with the school, it wasn't Shabina, but it was her brother who represented her, and he was part of an extreme right Muslim political group. At one point, this group held demonstrations outside the school, interestingly protesting not about the school uniform policy, but against the secular nature of education in that school. And the demonstrations had the effect of intimidating other female students who complained of harassment and interference from the group. And they actually didn't support Shabina's demands because they felt that if she was successful, they would be pressurized into wearing the full jilbab. And they feared deep divisions would be created in the school community, and that those who were perceived to be pious, between those who perceived to be pious and those who had lost their religious way. And they were afraid that if they didn't conform, they would be labeled bad Muslim girls. So the court recognized this, carried out a very careful balancing act, respecting both the diverse population, but also enabling those who didn't wish to conform to their religious identity to do so without fear of repercussions. And it was a very nuanced judgment, I think a judgment that was very difficult to make for the courts. However, much to my dismay, I have seen since that the entire judgment has been challenged from a so-called feminist perspective for not respecting Shabina's agency as a Muslim woman. For example, in a recent book in which legal feminist scholars have reinterpreted classic legal judgments from a feminist perspective, Maliha Malik has rewritten the judgment from a perspective which argues that what Shabina was doing was exercising her female autonomy and choice as a Muslim woman living in a minority. But in doing so, she conveniently skips the political context in which the case occurred. She makes no mention of the political demos that took place outside the school or her brother determining what was necessary to comply with Muslim beliefs. Most crucially, and I would say disingenuously, she avoids any mention of the fact that the majority of other Muslim girls wanted no change in the dress codes, presumably because what they had achieved was developed through their own complex negotiations and battles with their parents and their community. Their voices were nowhere to be heard in her judgment. And in rewriting that judgment, it is stated that she served to advance one of the goals of human rights and of feminism, to promote dignity and autonomy of the individual. But I think it's very intriguing that in the rewritten judgment, what we are in effect left with is some free-floating notion of female Muslim autonomy, removed from political and social movements that give rise to the kind of demands that Shabina was making. And the critical point is that she was exercising female agency through her brother, to counter the secular nature of the state school. And this is the point that other girls so readily recognized. So I will just wrap up. I have a minute. Nira has contributed in so many ways to the work of Southall Black Sisters, and more recently, she has helped us to conduct a study to look at how religious identity and belonging are viewed in the context of the users of our center, who are largely abused Black and minority women. And the findings show that the counter-hegemonic mobilizations around religious identity is itself problematic, especially on questions of gender and sexuality, since it assumes that those who are dispossessed and have no access or interaction with broader society naturally belong or identify with particular faith communities. I won't go into the findings of the study, but I would like to just end by saying, in refusing holy orders, right at the outset, there is a quote from Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, to show that there is more than one kind of freedom. There is, the authors say, freedom to as well as freedom from. But I would say that one of the problems that the women highlight in the SBS study is that the right to freedom, the right to manifest religion, has overshadowed the right to freedom from religion, and that there is an urgent need to de-link religion from public policy. And although actually that study, Nira and I had tried to get extra funding to develop it, but we've, for various variety of reasons, which I think are quite spurious, we've been rejected. In conclusion, Nira's work and that of others have helped SBS to address and campaign for the needs of the most marginalized and most vulnerable in more ways than I can show today. All I would like to say is thank you, Nira. You have challenged us to think and act in ways that stay true to the realities of those that we seek to help empower, even if those realities are often inconvenient for us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pragna. Gita?
Well, I have so much to say, and like everybody else, I went through the exercise of trying to remember when I first met Nira, and I actually had to ask her. And of course, neither of us remembered, because we've been in each other's lives for so very long that the actual first meeting has kind of disappeared in the mists of time. But we did, I know we met before we were founding members of Women Against Fundamentalism in '89, because I remember engaging with Nira through going to a conference of socialist feminism in the early '80s when I first came to Britain. That is, I'd come back to Britain after having been at university here, actually at SOAS. And I'd come from the Indian women's movement, from a very exciting moment in the Indian women's movement, where we'd been campaigning against rape, campaigning against dowry. We were stressing the importance of secularism. We were campaigning against the religious right, or aware of it, although many of the campaigns came later, and certainly of the way in which women's bodies are used to signify the honor of the community and so on. So these were not things that were gifted to us by a particular academic. But meeting Nira was an engagement along these issues. And when I walked into a socialist feminist space, which was largely white, I was not aware of myself as other, as it happened. But most of the socialist feminists who were there were very worried and frightened by the emergence of Black feminism and treated me as with great hostility. And Nira was about the one person who didn't. So that was, that was an early moment of a very fractured feminism. And I think we are here now in very fractured times as well. But we are also, unlike in the '80s, here today in revolutionary times. And I think that's something we haven't really reflected on during the course of today, that the last 20 odd years of analysis of the work that all of us have done as activists and certainly as academics, I think is really going to come under significant pressure. And I would say that my prediction will be us activists and practitioners will survive better than much of the academic work will survive, because a lot of judgments have been made about, for instance, the importance of religion in people's lives by academic writing, which doesn't take into account the way, why religion has become so important and why it has been, I believe, a contingent importance. It was something that arose very much in post-89, the defeat of the Soviet Union on the one hand and the triumph of neoliberalism. The rise of religious fundamentalism has often been analyzed as a rebuke to neoliberalism. But I believe, and I remember Nawal el-Saadawi saying this, that the culture of jeans and the culture of the headscarf, the culture of globalization and the culture of fundamentalism had gone hand in hand. And we can certainly see this with the politics of the Hindu right, I think the Jewish and the Christian right, and so on as well. They're embedded in the project of reactionary globalization. And identity politics has become imbued with that, although it's often, I think, mischaracterized and miscast as something separate. So I think that that discussion of what's happened alongside that is that there has been an absolutely concerted academic attack, and many of you can speak to this better than I can, but talking to Amrita Chachi, who's also stood against many of these, of many academic fashions because of her commitment as well to activism as well as to academic analysis. Amrita just said to me, well, Habermas has declared secularism, the secular project, dead. It's a post-secular age. The Enlightenment project, of course, has been cast aside as imbued with racism to the point of its complete irrelevance for any modern thinking. And actually or postmodern thinking, what we actually now have is a series of, post-structural, postmodern, post-this, post-that. I mean, most academic analysis has been post something or other and has defined itself against what it isn't and not what it is. And really, it's because it's been operating in a space of complete political defeat. And I think those of us who tried to stand against that political defeat, when we stood on a demonstration, 40-odd women, including Nira and Pragna and me, on a demonstration where we defended the right of Salman Rushdie to write satanic verses and our right not to be hindered in what we read by what some community leader or religious leader said to us. That was a very small stand against the twin projects of Thatcherite neoliberalism and Muslim fundamentalism that were rolling over Britain, and where Britain became the global organizing center for the religious right, which spread back across the world. Now, I actually think that Women Against Fundamentalism wasn't a very useful place for the forensic analysis of fundamentalism. It was a very useful place for the discussion of the shrinking space of secularism. And the discussions we had of secularism did not valorize the existing forms of secularism that there were. We discussed the secular projects of different countries in the full knowledge that as feminists who were attacking the classic public-private distinction, we couldn't then reapply it in the same way that classical liberal thinkers had thought of secular projects as separating religion from the public sphere, which we do believe in, but we also had a critique of the way in which secular projects like Indian secularism was deeply limited by the application of religious personal laws. And that, of course, applies to many places. Israel, often discussed as the only secular country in the Middle East, also has religious personal laws, and many, many others that have ever been influenced by British colonialism. But what we see happening now, I think, which is very troubling to me, is that a lot of parts of the analysis that you've made, Nira and Floya have made, and other people have made, are taken over as sound bites, rather than what the depth of the analysis is. So parts of the analysis of intersectionality, of acknowledging that women are part of nationalistic modernist projects and so on, that they've been used as symbols, those things are actually taken without, for instance, there's mountains of really bad writing, which cites your work on the war on terror, which will look at the stuff about racialized boundaries and so on in order to talk about the creation of the other, as if it was easy enough to say that what the war on terror was about was an attack on Muslims as such. Now, I'm not saying that Muslims didn't have a very hard time and that there weren't, there wasn't an attack on the human rights framework, there was clearly the use of torture, there was the use of surveillance on Muslim populations and so on, but the war on terror was not fueled by that was not its basis, was not just anti-Muslim feeling. And while ordinary Muslims have had a very rough time in the war on terror, Muslim leaders have benefited from it because the disciplinary project that was the war on terror has fundamentally relied on having fundamentalist allies, particularly the Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood, as proxies of Western interests. And I think when we're looking at the fight that's going on for the soul of the Egyptian revolution now, and looking at what might emerge from it, and what's happened in Tunisia, where most of the Western press has actually lauded the fact that Muslims have had an election, there's a sense sometimes looking at the way in which Muslims are discussed, and people often talk about racialized discourses, but they don't often look at the ethical discourse, where the underlying assumption is that Muslims are not capable as a people, and they're seen as largely as a people. This is by the same people who are saying that the West has talked about the Muslims as other, homogenize them and so on. You get a counter discourse which is saying, which is basically accepting the fact that Muslims don't have the ethical capacity to be other than led by some form of fundamentalism, or one kind or another fundamentalism. That ranges from thinkers on the far left to former security experts. And I think that's, that is one of the issues that that WAF actually itself was fractured by, that it wasn't fully enabled to engage with this. And what's interesting about that is that having avoided a racialized fracture in WAF for 20 years of its existence, and its existence in the early 90s, and then its revival later on, largely through Nira, with my help setting up a soup kitchen in her room, first of all, before we graduated to other meeting rooms, to talk about this, because the war on terror silenced radical white women in talking about these issues. And so those of us who came from minority backgrounds and the women of Muslim backgrounds in WAF were actually silenced in talking about issues of Muslim fundamentalism and the forensic analysis of Muslim fundamentalism, which would show us that organizations like the Jamaat-e-Islami, to which Georgie referred in her speech, were not only responsible for being central part of the genocide in 1971 in Bangladesh, but were also key figures, key actors. In fact, some of the very same people who I investigated in a film I made in the 90s were key actors in the genocide key actors in the Rushdie affair, as well as in the genocide in Bangladesh, and also partners of Tony Blair. And in his looking for Muslim allies, through the Muslim Council of Britain. And I'm grateful to Nira, where many academics would have run from this analysis and have actually erased it. So when they cite your work, they don't cite the work on fundamentalism. They do cite some of the work on racialized boundaries, only use it in a very partial manner without the political context. And I'm grateful to Nira for, one, encouraging me to write, so that when I look at my writings, many of them are in books that are actually edited by Nira, but also for being there for this contestation that Pragna referred to, which is about looking at the importance of human rights law and looking at the importance of your work, because I think the ways in which intersectionality has been understood in human rights law has been actually quite dangerous. It's been understood as a form of identity politics and promoting identity politics, and actually not in the way that you've been discussing it. And so there, I think, where Nira's work has been terribly important and where she's contributed to international political formations has been particularly through One Tribunal, which was an investigation of international feminists that was organized by Indian feminist activists when the Indian government was not allowing foreign international organizations, human rights organizations, into the country in order to investigate the massacres of Muslims by the Hindu right in Gujarat in 2002. And Indian feminists actually organized a group of very distinguished foreign feminists, including Nira, Sunila Abisekara from Sri Lanka, Rhonda Copeland, American lawyer, and so on, to look at this issue and to look at the idea of how identity construction and construction of the other and so on can actually lead to massive exterminationist acts of violence. In other words, what Nira termed a genocidal project, because in Gujarat and among Indian activists, we don't refer to what happened in Gujarat because it was a massacre of one side by the other. We don't refer to them as riots. It has been popularly, but also legally referred to as a genocide. And that thinking about genocide has really influenced my thinking when I was at Amnesty International in trying to understand what is genocide and how badly it's actually theorized and analyzed in international context, and to look more closely at in the context of denial of various genocides, such as in Bangladesh now, how important it is to actually reinstate that analysis, because what we have here in Britain is a very poisonous alliance between the far left and members of the Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi jihadi groups who are engaged with some academics in the process of genocide denial at the precise time, and precisely because there's been a popular movement for accountability for the genocide in Bangladesh in 1971. And because this movement has been an internal movement led by young activists who actually forced this issue onto the election, which also shows how the issue of the secularization of politics and issues of secularism are not only large issues in the Middle East, but also in areas like Pakistan and Bangladesh. That particular issue has not fed into the public consciousness of women's rights activism anywhere else in the world. And I think that shows, how difficult the space that we're in and how depoliticized the women's movement is, that it tends to talk about the issues which are UN-led, but not give cross-regional solidarity to people who are struggling in their own contexts for justice and accountability. So, Nira, we've had very many discussions about these things, and I look forward to seeing how you raise these issues in the politics of belonging, because I couldn't have done the work that I do on issues of crimes against humanity and genocide and all those legal issues that your brain shuts down at without the work that you do. but I think that we need to continue to have that analysis and continue with what we started with, and which Pragna briefly referred to, that Women Against Fundamentalism was about the way in which fundamentalism controls the mind and the body. And so much of the work that's being done now on sexual rights and erotic justice and so on fits neatly into the mold of identity politics by concentrating solely on the body and forgetting that the freedom of the mind and the freedom to be respectful and the freedom to be in various ways is actually the freedom not just of people to be free from religion, which is, I think, one of the most important freedoms, but also the freedom of those who are religious to be able to express their religious identity. But again, I want to say that I feel that you are what I would call an antinomian feminist. And I tried to develop that concept in a book that you edited, where I wrote a piece called Legislating Utopia. And the reason I talked about antinomianism is that I think when people and many academics researching religious identity fall into the trap of looking at fundamentalist groups as authentic working class groups expressing an authentic identity, because they don't understand that they're actually hearing the expression of a global political movement as it's expressed in very, very localized groups, whether they're Hindu right supposedly cultural groups or whether they're Muslim right or other groups. They don't understand what they're looking at, and they don't understand that those groups are actually about suppressing and evading and erasing the actual religious beliefs and practices of ordinary people that don't fit the kind of purity agendas that they're promoting in terms of their promotion of parallel legal systems and Muslim law, or their promotion of things like having new blasphemy laws and the so-called respect agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Gita. As usual, both Pragna and Gita provided us with some, lots of very concise, cutting, nuanced, and very thought-provoking ideas. I have lots of comments and questions, but I'm not going to abuse my role as chair, so I'm going to open it up to you.
Please use your role.
Okay, well, maybe I do. I will, while you think. Well, it's a question, something that I've been struggling with, and I guess I would like to sort of get your thoughts and maybe also Nira's, which is the question. Certainly, I very much share the strong dislike and resentment of identity politics. And I also very much share the knee-jerk reactions that certain political developments entice. But when I really sort of think reflectively, as Nira has been asking us to do, I find that some of my political engagement and my intersectionality is very, well, context-specific and depending on the intersubjective relationship with my audience. That is not to say that I go from right to left, but certainly, when I speak in London to you, to a mainly sort of feminist audience, or recently I was in Colorado Springs and I was speaking to people, previously retired military and business people, or I speak to some Iraqi academics, there is a shift in terms of emphasis, and my intersectionality takes on different meanings. And I was just wondering if you would reflect on that. And I think the main fault line, I think, on the issues that we're talking about often lies it's not just a matter of whether we're speaking to a sort of secular-oriented or religiously oriented audience. It's not that. But I do think there is a difference for those of us who are focusing more on diasporic issues around religious fundamentalism as manifested in the West. Then also those who work, in, let's say, my work, let's say Middle East. Again, I don't want to fall into, these simple dichotomies, but what's the significance of the intersubjective, what's happening between us as intellectuals, as activists, and whom we are engaging with, and how does that shift the emphasis of what we're talking about? Yes, I guess the most the painful example that I always give is that was shared by me by an Egyptian women's rights activist, a woman who had spent most of her life fighting against female genital mutilation in Egypt. And then when she went to a conference in New York and she was confronted by a US feminist who spoke about the racism in those countries, she found herself defending the practice. As she was telling me this, I always tell the story, as she was telling me this, she was crying and she said, I wouldn't do this anymore. I have found ways of coping with it. But I can very much relate to that pain and to that impulse and, constantly struggling to not have a knee-jerk reaction. And I was wondering if you could reflect on that, and maybe Nira as well.
I think I know what you're talking about, Nadia, because recently I was in Denmark at a conference on violence against women, and it was called Silencing Women's Voices. And I was really struck by the fact that the entire conference was taken up talking about black and minority women in that conference situation, and yet there was no black and minority women there. No, not one, except for me as a speaker from the UK. And it made me very, very uncomfortable. And then things got worse, because then the next day I had to go to a seminar, which I had agreed to go, which involved the refuge movement in Denmark, women, some who call themselves feminists, others who may not call themselves feminists. But nevertheless, they wanted me to take part in a seminar to discuss sort of practical issues and things around violence against women. And when I went to the refuge, I know that the refuge took black minority women in, but they were hidden, completely hidden, even as users. And the seminar, again, was an all-white affair. And I was the only black woman there. And what made me very I had spent my entire, the day before the conference, because it was about black minority women, I was there talking, trying to stay true to the experiences of Southall Black sisters, and talking about how difficult it is to tread that fine line between critiquing internally around issues of honor and shame and silence and so on, and also then having to talk about the state and the impact of the state on the silencing process. And in fact, I always make the point of saying you cannot contextualize violence. You have to contextualize violence against women discussions. And you've got to talk about family, community, state, and the interlocking sort of ways in which that works to silence women. And yet, so I'm trying to stay true to that experience, which means not trying to stay silent about the kind of ways in which family and community, but in a context that is incredibly right-wing and racist. And then when I went to the seminar the next day, and it was even more discomforting, because they were talking about black minority women and issues of honor and shame, and they were all white women. And I was saying, well, as in terms of service providers, I think it's great. I think it's great that you're creating the space so that black minority women can come, and you're understanding the kind of specificity of their issues. However, at some point, if you are feminist, you're talking about feminist engagement and feminist organization, you're going to have to allow some black women's voices to come to the fore and speak, so that they can speak for themselves. And I know that Denmark has an entirely different history of migration. But nevertheless, what was interesting for me and what really discomforting for me was when they said, oh, but you know, when they come here, we say to them, you've got to now adopt the Danish way of life and adopt Danish values. And you can't go around beating your children because that's not Danish values. And things like that, which made me just want to almost in a knee-jerk way say, excuse me, you know. And it's the worst kind of essentialization, racialization, whatever you want to call it, othering, whatever you want to call it going on, racism, in fact. And what interested me was that, you see, what's happened, I think, particularly around violence against women issues in Europe, is that, particularly in European countries where there's been no anti-racist struggle and no politicization, is that they've kind of gone from being a completely racist and assimilationist position to this kind of integrationist, which is also an assimilationist position, without the politics. And so that enables them to say these kinds of really racist things and operate in this really racist way. And it's really difficult to engage in that. And yet, on the other hand, you know, we have our guiding. Whenever we were attacked, and in the early days of SBS, we were always attacked, you know, for washing dirty linen in public and so on and so forth. And, you know, and our view was always that there are no hierarchies in struggles, and that actually to keep quiet about one at the expense of the other is to collude in that struggle. And so you have to be true to that. But contexts do matter. And I do think that sometimes so in that Danish context, I did try to spend as much time as I could also talking about the racist discourse of integration and trying to emphasize, and maybe, I did sort of move into emphasizing that a bit more, but I felt that was the audience and I had to do that. I don't know if that helps, but...
I think I'd like to address another way of looking at some of these issues. And I think one does really have to have a transnational approach to that, because I think a local, looking at it locally sometimes gets one stuck into particular types of binaries. And so one of the things, for instance, the attack on human rights, which comes from various sources. I mean, it comes from the left, it comes from the right. It, obviously came from the Bush and Blair governments during the war on terror in terms of promoting torture, trying to legalize forms of torture and so on. But, one of the things that's said that's been quite damaging, and it's accepted by quite a lot of these people right across the board, even if they disagree with each other, is that human rights is a Western concept. And clearly, it has a Western lineage. It is a Western concept, and I think we need to actually not be embarrassed about that. It is Western in some respects. That is, it's descended from certain types of thinking from the Enlightenment. But there's a more complex argument about who formed the Enlightenment. Why are key Muslim thinkers who were part of the Enlightenment excluded from being Enlightenment thinkers? And then if you do include them, then are Muslims also responsible for the Enlightenment and all its ills, and so on? So that's one level of argument. But another in which you can really make your head hurt, right, going round and round in circles if you into the blame game and who's responsible for what. But another level is actually a simple reversion to certain kinds of storytelling, and that is actually to restoring some of the hidden histories. And actually our histories are so recent, and they're completely wiped out of most academic narratives around these things, because most of the stuff that, for instance, is now their books published in defense of multiculturalism, which do not look at any of our work. So it's not as if they critique it, which would be fine. I'm very happy to be comprehensively trashed if anybody actually looks at anything that we've written in order to trash it, but they don't engage with it at all. Except for Salman Saeed, who was once called Bobby Saeed, and he engaged with it to call us Eurocentric, Nira, and refusing holy orders. And then I met him somewhere, and then he was very mournful and said, "You don't remember me," and I was on a platform with you. And I said, "I'm really sorry, I have a really bad memory. I don't remember being on a platform with you." It turned out that he was on a platform with Nira and not with me, so we fused together in his mind. but anyway, I think we need to tell another kind of story. I mean, the point about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is it was not written by Eleanor Roosevelt alone. And the decolonized countries of the world, which included Latin America and certainly included India and Pakistan, were at that table, and women were at that table and played a crucial role, Indian and Pakistani women, at that table and played a crucial role in the language of the Declaration, including the right to choice in marriage, and the fact that the Declaration doesn't just say the rights of men, but of all men and women are equal in dignity and rights. Because, as they pointed out, the Asian women pointed out, Hansa Mehta, an Indian feminist, pointed out that if you say only men, it won't be assumed to include women. Under the framing of men, which was of course until that time all legal documentation, women were assumed to be under the rubric of mankind. So we need to tell a different kind of story about the struggles that have gone, including the anti-colonial struggles that have gone into the creation of this framework, and why it remains an important point of defense for those of us who are fighting for secular and progressive values, even though the framework itself has really failed to defend secular values at quite crucial moments. So I think that there's another way of dealing with some of these, binary problems.
Thank you. Would you like to say a few words, Nira?
I absolutely agree with both responses, both of Pragna and Gita, to the very difficult but very real problem of Nadia. And this is, of course, an issue that have accompanied that for many years, also in issues of Zionism. This accusation of washing dirty laundry in public was, always addressed to us as well whenever we criticized Israel and Zionism. But the issue, of course, is part of context, part of history, because, in a sense, what you said about the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights means that it is not a Western project. And therefore, what you said at the beginning, actually, I don't agree, as I said at the beginning, because I do not consider it to be. Although, as you said in your presentation, and I do write about it in Politics of Belonging, I do have a critique of the discourse of human rights when it's stands on its own and it's not contextualized. But I think in terms of the issue of which context, I remember actually in SOAS there was a big debate between Denise Candioti and Afsaneh Najmabani about feminism, and Afsaneh said after the Iranian Revolution you cannot talk about feminism because it's a grand narrative and it has nothing in common with what the women on the ground in Iran and so on. You have to have piecemeal discussion and so on. And Denise he said, yes, you can have piecemeal, but one statement of one mullah and works of years can get away. But on the other hand, of course, when you have secular spaces, you can engage in debates in which, in other spaces, so the context is very important. And what you talked about in Denmark and so on, again, is another opposite context, and again you have to do. What I mostly dislike and see as dangerous is the works like of so-called feminists like Saba Mahmoud, who put the politics of piety as an alternative to feminism, as if you are not in the West, issues of power does not matter, and empowerment only in terms of self-perfection as the only space that is open with women became a virtue. And I think this is where context is not important, that you have to transcend the context in which to talk about this issue. But at the same time, I've always, I'm very, very sensitive, and in the debates in WAF and so on, to the context. And of course, the interpretation in terms of racism is sometimes inevitable, but you have to be explicit. You cannot just assume always that you have shared values with other people. And this is why, as probably I say afterwards, I distinguish so sharply between caring and solidarity. Because solidarity, I assume, shared values, while caring is for everyone.
Thank you. Okay, we can take a couple of first. Yes, please. Do you want to introduce
I
yourself?
not very much what everything that Gita said, but I would like to take an exception to one remark, and that is including the far left as an undifferentiated entity.
I put my hand up.
What she said applies to that so-called far left that is not far left enough. we should be very careful not to fall into bed with those Houstonites who are apologists for so-called humanitarian imperialist intervention, who also criticize the far left. But I mean, that it's true that some parts of the so-called far left have colluded with the various Islamists and so on for opportunistic reasons, but that is because they are not far enough.
Fair enough. No, he doesn't. No. So Ulrike?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the really inspiring speech, as usual. I wanted to make some comments to what you, Nadia and Pragna, also responded in terms of the context of speech. And I was wondering, and also related to my current experience in the Netherlands, that I think we have to face up to a situation. If we're talking about Europe, there is this really fundamental distinction between the UK context, and most of you are based in the UK and familiar with this, let's say from a continental perspective, still sort of, inverted commas, haven for at least having the space to think more in a radical way, and also at least giving space to different voices, because probably similar to the situation you encountered, Pragna, in Denmark, that's very much my experience in the Netherlands. So even talking about racism or talking about more radical or political context is really put under the carpet. So you really have to face up to sort of pragmatism, to some kind of flat interest in academia as well. So that's highly rewarding, actually. And most critical voices are losing jobs, are marginalized. So it's, in my view, it's coming down to some sort of, we have a shelter, we might have a niche, and it shouldn't basically stop us of thinking as you do and contributing to a more complex debate. But being aware that this is really the exception to the rule. And yeah, it's even worse, as Gita was describing. What's very handy is using sometimes concepts like intersectionality or even like diversity, integration. I mean, these are really kind of catchphrases, but it's not thought through, and it's not even, there's not even kind of support to continue thinking about it. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here today to listen to more inspiring talk, I have to say.
Yes, please.
This is perhaps a not fully formed question, but something that I'm picking up in a lot of the discussions are the opening and closing of disparate narratives. So we're talking about ideological narratives, narratives from positions of power, really in conflict with individual narratives and narratives that are on a much more micro scale. How language can open things up and how language can close things down, like the word diversity. Looking forward, how do we start to approach developing narratives that on the one hand don't close things down, but on the other hand reach a dominance that allows narratives or dominant narratives now to start to be challenged? And I'd really appreciate Pragna's and Gita's view on this. If that makes sense, I can try and clarify the question.
No, it's a very clear question.
That's clear.
In one sentence, one can answer.
Please try.
Yes, please.
I mean, it's the question that can I answer.
Ruth, do you want to directly engage with that before, or is that something else?
Slightly smaller one that goes back to the previous discussion. Can I just make a quick point where you can answer this,
Okay.
please?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to say something really reactionary. I was thinking about that conference that Gita talked about, the Socialist Feminist Conference in 1984, and I wanted to make a plea to remember the intersection analysis when you're talking about the native feminist movement. I remember that conference, and there was a lot of mutual learning about different positionalities. And I remember somebody, do you remember, Gita, you talked about the refuge in Southall and how it had 2 kitchens. Do you remember this? And somebody said, oh, is that one for vegetarian and one not? And you looked at them and you said, no, there was one upstairs and one downstairs. But, you know, and there was a lot of discussion about whether it was all right to go on a march against violence against women, and so on and so forth. But the impulse and the energy to organize that conference came from a long tradition of anti-imperialism and socialist feminism. And so I think that one ought to actually remember this rather than characterize the white feminist movement as not having any of the, well, anyway, can we just be a bit careful about how we talk about this, our shared history?
Okay, okay, I'll take one more question, comment, and then I'll ask you to, Leili.
Thank you so much. I keep coming to conferences about secularism, religion, community, collectivity, women's rights, feminism. I constantly have this question taken back with me home because it's constantly recurring in different contexts. I was wondering, given the celebration of also new public spheres in terms of the internet, social networking, and that all of you somehow refer to the context of speech. Nadia triggered that, and then Nira's point of the need to transcend context when it comes to certain notions. And then again, the fact that there are no hierarchies in struggle. I was wondering whether you believe that there is still certain, even though we try to transcend the context, we try to keep certain notions as universal, but there is a certain selectivity in the way our words are being, reflected elsewhere. Is there a way? I don't know if it's kind of a reflection from me. Is there a way we can control the way our words in a particular context are being reflected in another context and used and abused?
Thank you. Okay, Gita, you would like to have a first go?
Yeah. Gal, I think you've posed the question of the day, really. And, I recently started something which, is struggling with this question, which is, what we call the Center for Secular Space, which is precisely to retell different stories and to challenge some of these dominant narratives. The dominant narratives aren't necessarily the ones that are said to be the dominant narrative. There's a dominant narrative of the state, for instance, on the war on terror, but there's the counter narrative of a lot of the progressives, and I take Moshek's point that it's more complex than I, in the short space made out to be in terms of divisions on the left and so on. But some of the counter narratives actually are part of the problem, wherever they've come from. It's not only the far left, it's from all sorts of places. How do we challenge that? Well, we have to try. Meetings like this, putting out the work, doing it in cyberspace, and I'm a dinosaur, in relation to using things like Twitter and all this, which have been, so central in the mobilizing of social of the revolutions that are going on now. But I think, there are people who use it naturally because they're of a different generation and they put out messages much quicker and easier on that. How can we control what's said in our name? In our case, a lot of what we say is wiped out. It's not so much that it's used in different ways. Quite often it's simply not taken account of at all. So it's not engaged with, it's not debated with. As I said, I don't think that we can control what happens, as Nira, Floya, and others can't control what other people do with their work. They can simply restate and grow in their own positioning. But I think that's an important point, that we can clarify again and again what we mean. We can come back to some of the things that we said before. I was very struck by something Nadia said this morning around the contestations around the idea of the nation. I come from a post-nationalist generation in India. I grew up in independent India. Our main enemy, as it were, was the Indian state, the failures of the state to bring about social justice, to prevent, religious violence, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in the course of that, one of the things we did was criticize the nature of Indian secularism and the limitations on Indian secularism. What's happened with that is that a lot of identity, feminists promoting various forms of religious identity politics have taken that part of the critique to criticize and trash secularism as a concept entirely. And all we can say, and I've had to do this recently, is to say, I've spent my life criticizing nationalism and nationalist projects and what they failed to do for women, but actually I have to look at them now, when we look at them in relation to fundamentalist projects, that actually they did give space for women to mobilize. A woman like Hansa Mehta, who is an Indian feminist, active in the Congress, was sent to the table of the United Nations to take part in the drafting of the declaration without quotas and things like that women are still fighting for. And there is another story there. There were the failures, but there was a space created. And one of the issues is that feminists have also stopped talking about the nature of the state. And many of the debates I've seen trashing secularism say states aren't important because all states have failed. The Shah of Iran was repressive. It was a secular project. Turkey's repressive. I'm grateful to Nira for giving me the opportunity to debate with Haleh Afshar on this point. It's on podcast on the UAL website. She doesn't mention that Khomeini's regime might have had a chilling effect on the possibility of religion as a force for progress. But it's a very one-sided discussion. There's a final point, Ruth. I'm not reflecting everybody's views. There were a lot of different things said at the time, and I wasn't even reflecting everything that I said, and I'm so glad you remembered it. You said to me at an AWID conference, when we were all divided up, and I came to the European feminist part, I don't know if you remember, it was a timeline. You were developing a feminist timeline, and you turned to me and said, I'm so glad you think of yourself as a feminist. And I must say that really surprised me, because if there's one thing I've defined myself as, I might have stuck other labels on myself as socialist and so on at various points, but feminist, I think, is a label I've always had, an uncontested label, but maybe it was contested. So I think we have different memories, and it wasn't a discussion of that forum. It was just a mention of it.
Thank you, Gita. We need to quickly move to the next session, but I'll give Pragna the chance to reply back.
Just to Gul's point, I think that one of the problems that I've come to the realization that we just have to keep producing these narratives, and we really have to keep producing the evidence. I think the evidential base for what we say is so critical, and sometimes you make these arguments and you just don't have enough of the illustrations to make those arguments. And I'm now trying to refocus some of the work for Southall Black Sisters, particularly around collecting those stories and trying to put them out in the public domain. And that's what this study was about. This study was really about countering the Southall Black Sisters study, which is Faith, Cohesion and Gender, is based on interviews of 21 women, in-depth interviews, women from different ethnicities and religious backgrounds, who are talking about their feelings about belonging and identity. And they say some fantastic things. And that's the other thing. I think there is an assumption that these women are sort of empty vessels who come to us and we kind of fill them with the kind of feminism and the progressiveness. And actually a lot of them have said things that lead us to make the comments that we do publicly and make the points that we do publicly. And they've blasted a hole through this whole notion of faith communities and this idea that they naturally belong to faith communities. They blast a hole through this, in terms of their identities as religious identities. And what they say is that religion for us is a very personal matter. It is spiritual. They're all believers actually, but they all say that religion is a personal matter, but we do not want religion encroaching in terms of public institutions, and the services that we desperately need from the state cannot be imbued with religious values, because dominant religious values, right-wing religious values often hold sway. So I think we need more and more of those stories, however they come out. And we can't control. We can't control, but I think what we can do is just be better at what we do and really struggle for our survival. I think that's the other main issue for a lot of us, is that feminist organizations are going. There is a resurgence of feminism, but some of the wonderful work that secular feminist organizations have done up and down the country, those centers, are disappearing fast. So yes, there is an urgency to write down that history too.
Thank you. Well, please help me in thanking Pragna and Gita.
I'd like to now invite Avishai Ehrlich to join me. Ah, sorry. So I will give you a warning if